Good evening from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. You're looking at a live view of Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, around 4 miles away, where a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket is awaiting a launch opportunity tonight. Liftoff is scheduled for 10:09 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. That's 2:09 a.m. UTC. You're seeing a bit of venting now from the strongback. Fueling, propellant loading has not yet begun. These vents are associated with some pre-tanking activities out at Pad 40. We often see these in the final 90 minutes to 2 hours before launch. Liftoff now 1 hour, 21 minutes away. This mission will be carrying another batch of Starlink internet satellites to orbit. There are 51 spacecraft for the Starlink constellation on tonight's mission. This is a few less satellites on this particular launch compared to most Starlink missions that are flown out of Cape Canaveral. We typically see 53 or 54 Starlink satellites on each Falcon 9 launch from the Cape. That reduction in number of Starlinks is to accommodate the Rideshare Payload on tonight's mission. The Rideshare Payload for tonight's mission is a secondary payload. It's an orbital transfer vehicle called the Sherpa LTC. This secondary payload will actually deploy first from the Falcon 9 rocket after it arrives in orbit, and then use its own propulsion system to climb into a much higher orbit. It'll be maneuvering from a preliminary altitude of about 196 miles up to more than 600 miles, or about 1,000 kilometers above Earth. And there, this orbital transfer vehicle, this Sherpa spacecraft built by the company Spaceflight in Seattle, will begin performing a series of experiments with a hosted payload called Varuna. This Varuna technology demonstration mission is a V-band broadband communications experiment for Boeing, and it's a precursor to a proposed constellation of 147 broadband satellites that Boeing is studying and may develop to provide high-speed communications connectivity, like internet, to federal government users as well as potentially commercial customers down the road. None of those satellites are currently on the cusp of launching, but this is a Pathfinder tech demo payload for Boeing's proposed Varuna constellation. We're about 45 minutes or so from the start of propellant loading. That's the next major milestone that will occur at T-minus 35 minutes. We'll be joined around 9:15 p.m. Eastern by Jonathan McDowell. He's an astrophysicist and an expert tracker of launch activity and satellite activity. He keeps a very well edited website called planet4589.org, and he'll be joining us to talk about the Starlink constellation and perhaps other topics, and we welcome your questions for him when he joins us, and we'll try to take as many of those as we can. So we'll be back in a few minutes with another update on the Falcon 9 countdown and our discussion with Jonathan McDowell. Hello, I'm Stephen Clark, editor of spaceflightnow.com. Thanks for joining us. We're here at the Kennedy Space Center covering the launch of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket and the Starlink 4-20 mission. Tonight's flight will be carrying 51 more satellites to orbit to join SpaceX's Starlink constellation. And I believe this launch will be pushing the total number of Starlink satellites launched above 3,200. And I know that because I go to a website, planet4589.org, that's edited by Dr. Jonathan McDowell, who works at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. And he has edited this website for many years, and I'm joined by Dr. Jonathan McDowell now. Thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here, Stephen.
So tonight's launch will be adding 51 more satellites to the world's largest internet constellation. You edit a website that not only tracks the Starlink constellation and the ever-changing numbers of spacecraft in orbit with every launch and reentry, but you also run this website that is a great resource for not only space reporters but space enthusiasts around the world. Can you start with Starlink? How do you keep track of all these launches, all these reentries, and you seem to be changing those numbers every day?
Pretty much, yes. I mean, it's a real challenge. You know, I started this game back in the really in the 70s for myself, and then on the web in the late 80s with you know, very manual. Right. Oh, there's another launch over the time thing. And of course, you know, now the launches are on an industrial scale. So how do you keep up with that? And I still have a big manual component to it, but I have code that goes through the latest TLEs, the latest orbital data from Space Force, and tries to compare the orbit of each Starlink satellite with what its orbit was a couple days ago, and flag if it's changed state in a significant way. So there's a lot of, you know, pretty crunchy algorithms that go through, and then I sort of review manually to go, okay, that looks good. And so I identify certain operational shells that they're in, and I kind of flag, okay, is it in one of the operational shells? If so, which one? Is it higher than it was last week, so it's ascending, or is it going down, or is it drifting, doing a plane drift? And so I've got it to the point now where all of that is pretty reliable and pretty automatic based on a bunch of slightly iffy heuristics. And then when a new launch goes up, I just have to enter the catalog numbers in a file and just make it run. So I'm hoping that tonight, when that goes up, I'll be able to run the code, and the code takes like 20 minutes to run to get through everything, and I'll be able to then just push the updated statistics to the website with relatively little manual intervention.
So, curious, how can you compare this constellation to anything else that's been launched? I mean, it's an order of magnitude almost bigger than anything else right now, the Starlink
Absolutely.
constellation.
Yeah, no, it's a whole new thing, but of course it's only the first of a bunch that plan to be this big, and so it's a sign of the future, and so you know, when the first Starlink launch came up, right, it was pretty alarming for astronomers, because we saw these bright things in the sky, and at that point there were only 60, but we can do math. So okay, if they're really going to launch 30,000 of these, that's going to be an issue. And then just from the space debris point of view, you know, the constellation operators will tell you, well, yeah, it's no problem, we can phase the orbits and do the automatic dodging and all of that, and it's not going to be an issue. I am skeptical, and everyone I know outside of the constellation operators is also a tad skeptical that this is going to go well in the long run. If we really get up to something like 100,000 working LEO satellites, that's going to be dramatic. And so I've been, you know, I also do plots of like the space statistics of various kinds, including the number of active satellites in various orbital regimes. And so if you look at one thing that's interesting is if instead of just plotting the total number of active satellites, which a lot of people do, if you plot the total number of active satellites that are more than 100 kilograms and below 600 kilometers, so in the lower part of LEO, then what you see is this just really transformational change in the past few years, where Starlink now totally dominates over both other satellites and debris in that orbital range. And so it really is, we're in a whole new space traffic regime.
So when they designed the constellation, well, I guess they redesigned because originally they were going to go to a higher altitude. They went lower, they say, to mitigate the risk from space debris, to allow those satellites to re-enter faster if they failed in space. That's, they lowered the altitude, but that's a much more heavily trafficked region by the International Space Station. Every launch that goes to a higher altitude has to go through that regime. What kind of trade-off was that, do you think?
Yeah, and it's also, by the way, better for professional astronomers because they're not above the horizon for as long a time if they're in the lower orbits. So there are pluses and minuses to that. I think it is responsible. I think you want to be in a lower orbit so that if things go wrong, things will re-enter in a finite time. And I'll contrast that, for example, with the OneWeb constellation, which is the other constellation that's sort of partly deployed. It's only got 400 satellites up so far, and that's up at 1,200 kilometers. And that's a much less heavily trafficked regime. But on the other hand, if a satellite fails, it's going to be up there for pretty much ever. And so as a result, the individual OneWeb satellites are more heavily engineered, I would say, and they have a very high reliability, but that presumably means each one's more expensive. So it is an interesting trade. Another thing that I think doesn't get enough attention is that the fraction of the time that of their lifetime that Starlink satellites are in their operational orbit is lower than a lot of people think. That the fraction of the time they spend on the way up and on the way down is actually significant. And they don't just go, they pop off. So when these 51 satellites pop off the launch vehicle today, assuming the launch goes well, they don't immediately boost their orbits to the 500-kilometer orbit. About a third of them will, and that will take about a month. But 2/3 of them will stop at like 350 kilometers and go in a drift orbit for several months to take advantage of the differential orbital plane precession at the different altitudes. What that basically means is they want to fill different orbital planes, and they can use an orbital mechanics trick to do that for free by just pausing the ascent for a month or two. But what that means is that it's going to take, several months to get to the point where all of those satellites are in their final orbit. And with the rate that we're seeing of launches, that means there's an awful lot of Starlinks that are still stuck in this halfway house on the way up stage.
I want to bring in some viewer questions in a moment. So if you're watching on YouTube, if you have a question for Dr. McDowell, please enter that into the chat. We'll pitch that to Jonathan. You mentioned the brightness concerns, reflectivity. There were some mitigations that SpaceX put into place, I think a couple of years ago after the first few launches, visors on these satellites. I don't think those are on there anymore. Have you seen any change in brightness?
Yeah, we have. So they stopped flying the visors about a year ago, I guess, when they introduced the Starlink 3000 series satellites with support for the laser crosslinks. And because the visors got in the way and so on and so forth. And so instead they're using some fancy film that makes the antennas less reflective. And that's, that's very impressive, but these more recent satellites are actually about a magnitude brighter than the visor sats. And so that's a magnitude is about a factor of 2.5. And so they're still, decently faint, but they're not as faint as they were. And when we do optical measurements, we find that the bulk of the constellation is sort of faint-ish. It's magnitude 6 or so, but some fraction of the constellation at any one time, depending on the sun angle and so on, can be as bright as magnitude 3 or 4. And so we certainly see some very bright satellites. And that's for the current design. And of course, as you know and are about to ask me, there is a new generation on its way, the Starlink Generation 2, which are going to be way bigger satellites and also possibly in somewhat lower orbits. And so we're really concerned about how that's going to play out. I mean, I'm sure that SpaceX are putting a lot of effort into trying to mitigate the brightness, but it's hard to see that they can do it well enough to really avoid these things being super bright. And what isn't clear from FCC filings I've seen is whether they still plan this Generation 2, even though they're bigger, to be this enormous number of 30,000 satellites. And that's something that would be nice to get more clarity on, because there are really 30,000 of these enormous ones popping out of the Pez dispenser from the starships when they finally fly. That's going to be interesting, and not in a good way. And of course, SpaceX have also said that they're going to start launching Gen 2 sats on Falcon 9s, because they realize that Starship isn't actually going to be ready. And so, but maybe they're not going to be the full up Starlink Gen 2s, but some smaller version, and that's very murky. So it's the usual story with SpaceX that you'd always want like just a little bit more technical information to be able to assess what the impact's going to be.
Yeah, we've heard Elon Musk, I think last week, a couple of weeks ago, mention that these Starlink V2 satellites will be like 7 meters in size, and that's significantly larger than the version that's currently launching that we're about to see launch tonight. I think those are in diameter in terms of the body. I think just a handful of meters. Yeah.
Yeah, 2 by 3, I think they are roughly, and the solar cell's like 9 meters tall on the top of it, but the bus is more like 3 meters across. So yeah, this is twice as big in linear size, 4 times as big in area, at a rough guess. And so yeah, that's frightening. Although still not as big, I think, as some of the other constellation satellites that are being planned, like AST and Science's Blue Walker satellites, which are going to be, I forget exactly how big, but truly enormous, and very shiny and very frightening. So I don't want to, I don't want people to think I'm piling on SpaceX per se. My concerns are about all of these enormous constellations that are preparing to fly. And of course, today, as well as the 51 Starlink satellites, we've got the Boeing test satellite that's going up as a rideshare, right? Which is the first of a Boeing constellation that, if I had my crib sheet here somewhere, I would know.
I think it's 147, I believe.
Well, the total number planned, I believe, if it's the constellation I'm thinking about, is 5,800.
Yeah, they said this one is a demonstration for the V-band component.
Well, that's what their 2021 V-band proposal was for. Almost 6,000 satellites in a range of altitudes, mostly around 1,000 kilometers, and with a few much higher up, and in a range of inclinations. So that's a constellation that will be, again, problematic for astronomers just because of its high altitude. And so this is the first, I think, of the V bands to go up, right? Because I'm not. Is eSpace a V band or a K? I think it's a KUKA band. And so that's a whole other set of constellations that are now reaching the pad, if you like. And so we're seeing this starting slow. Oh, Starlink, but now we're getting all of these other companies are maturing their constellations. Amazon's finally going to launch its first satellite soon, I believe. And so we're going to see more and more of this as in the next couple of years, and it's going to be. I think it's going to get to the point where it's dramatic, just for people looking at the night sky.
To the naked eye.
To the naked eye.
Yeah.
And about, the ones that the astronomers are most scared about are the 1,000-kilometer altitude ones that are too faint to see with the naked eye, but leave a lot of streaks on telescopes. But the low altitude ones are the ones that are naked eye, and if everything that's applied for gets launched, it's going to really change what it looks like when you go outside, certainly from any relatively dark area.
You mentioned the Blue Walker satellite. That's on the next Starlink mission launching next weekend. That's an array that's 64 square meters in size. Mm-hmm. That's significant.
Yeah. Right. So that's 64 squares. So that's 8 by 8, right? Mm-hmm. So not that much bigger than the Starlink Gen 2s. It's the same kind of size, and it's but I don't think they've made the same kind of effort to make it not shiny. And so
it's going to be. We'll see what it looks like, I guess, after it launches.
We definitely want to do observations of that and get sort of quantitative information on what it looks like before they put up thousands of them. But also just something with that big a cross section in LEO, if they're going to be launching thousands of those, that's going to be really interesting from the space traffic management point of view.
We do have a viewer question asking the life expectancy of these satellites. I'm not sure if you know that, but maybe you've been tracking how long these satellites are in orbit when they launch, when they re-enter. What are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, so it's now 3 years since the first launch, right, for Starlink. The nominal lifetime for the operational satellites is 5 years. So the idea is that you replace them every 5 years, and if it's 3 months or so to go up and a couple months to come down, that's maybe 20% of their life, or 10% of their lifetime at least is in the intermediate phases, right? And so, but we've actually seen quite a lot of satellites come down shorter than the 5-year lifetime. And I'm just going to refer to my crib sheet again here. So far, we've had about 300 satellites, Starlink satellites, re-enter out of the 3,200 that we launched. So about 10% of them are already down. Now that's a number of reasons. Some were prototypes that were deliberately deorbited. Then there was a whole bunch that got caught by that geomagnetic storm. But there have certainly been 100 or so, I would say, at least, and probably more, that have been retired early. And so that's so maybe that's only a few percent of less than 10% of the operational thing, but there's a significant number that go up, get to 500 kilometers, operate for 6 months, and then they bring them down again. It's like, oh, guess something went wrong. And so that's the fun of this Starlink statistics page that I have, is that you can click on each satellite and see its height versus time and see what it's up to and kind of infer from that, okay, that one must have had a problem. That one seems to be doing good. Why are they moving this one a little bit? And so hopefully other people using my page will have as much fun as I do in like exploring that and seeing what they're up to.
Yeah, we just showed your Starlink stats page. It's on planet4589.org. And we're here with Jonathan McDowell, the editor of that page. He's an astrophysicist. He works at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. Just want to give a quick update to our listeners on the countdown. We have passed the T-minus 35-minute point a couple of minutes ago. So the propellant loading of the Falcon 9 out at Pad 40 has begun. They're loading about 1 million pounds of RP1 kerosene and liquid oxygen into the rocket at this time. And that fueling will continue, that tanking will continue down until about T-minus 2 minutes. And then at that point, they'll close the fill and drain valves, and the rocket will begin pressurizing for launch. Liftoff remains scheduled for 10:09 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, 2:09 a.m. UTC. And again, this launch from Cape Canaveral will be carrying 51 more Starlink internet satellites to orbit, adding to the world's largest constellation of satellites, as well as a tech demo payload for a future proposed constellation from Boeing to test out some technology for Boeing's proposed constellation of internet satellites. So, Jonathan, before I let you go, our listeners, our readers, our viewers will know that the rate of launches around the world has drastically increased over these last couple of years. I think we're up to 106 or so, correct me if I'm wrong, orbital launches so far this calendar year. You talk about how that launch rate has been increasing and what's been driving that increase in launches around the world.
Right. And as I say, the number of orbital launches per year isn't dramatically more than it was at the height of the Cold War. We had typically 120 launches a year in the 1970s, mostly Soviet spy satellites. What's really changed is that the typical number of satellites per launch has gone way up. And some of that, of course, is CubeSats, so the total mass is not necessarily going up that much. But we really have a dramatic increase in the number of satellites being launched each year, from 100 or so up to more than 1,000 a year. And that is a lot to keep track of. And I think what doesn't get talked about enough is it's not just Starlinks, right? In a way, that's easy to keep track of because they're all kind of the same. With the CubeSats, it's so many different startup companies that the number of players is a lot larger than it used to be, dramatically so. And that's really hard to keep track of. It's not, when you're trying to do space traffic management and you have to find the owner of a satellite that's about to come near you or something like that, that becomes intractable the way we do it now when there are so many different operators. And the other thing that's just in the past couple of years is that commercial, a few years ago, commercial activity in space started to outpace government activity a lot. For a long time, commercial activity was about a third of space activity, and now it's the vast majority of space activity. But what's new is there's a true Chinese commercial space sector that's taken over in China. And so all that commercial activity, a significant amount of it is Chinese, as well as American and European and Western countries. And so that's something that I think we haven't really come to grips with yet in the governance of outer space and how to safely operate in outer space is that rise of the Chinese commercial sector.
So another launch on the books tonight. This will be the 40th launch by SpaceX this year. More than half of those have been Starlink missions carrying an average of 50 or so satellites on each of these. So we thank you for joining us, Dr. Jonathan McDowell. He's the editor of the website planet4589.org. On Twitter, he is at planet4589. Definitely recommend you follow him on Twitter and check out his website if you're interested in any technical aspects about spaceflight or launch activity. He's the guy to go to. So thanks for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Stephen. Good to be here.
All right. Hello again from the Kennedy Space Center. I'm Stephen Clark, resuming our live commentary for the countdown tonight for the launch of a Falcon 9 rocket from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida. We're now 24 minutes away from liftoff, which is set for 10:09 and 40 seconds p.m. Eastern Time, 2:09:40 UTC. You're seeing some of the frost building up on the outer skin of the Falcon 9 first stage. That's from the loading of liquid oxygen, which is chilled down to several hundred degrees below zero into the Falcon 9 first stage. Below the liquid oxygen tank is the RP-1 kerosene tank. And kerosene fuel is also being loaded into the first stage at this time. Kerosene also is loading into stage 2, which is the white cylinder above the darker first stage at near the top of the rocket, just below the payload fairing at the very top of the Falcon 9. That is a new component. The second stage is new on every Falcon 9 launch. Kerosene, again, is also loading into that stage at this time. This view of the Falcon 9 on pad 40 comes from about 4 miles away. The 4 towers on either side of the rocket are the lightning protection masts at pad 40. These have these flashing blue aviation hazard lights, and these are in place to protect the rocket from lightning strikes while it's exposed out on the launch pad before a mission. Just to the right of the Falcon 9 itself is the strongback structure. That's the umbilical tower, also doubles as the transporter that the Falcon 9 rides on horizontally out to the pad before each launch, and then it raises the Falcon 9 vertical in the final day or so before launch. And again, inside the payload fairing of this Falcon 9 is the payload for tonight's mission, which consists of 51 spacecraft set to join the Starlink internet constellation. And there's also a rideshare payload on tonight's mission. It's an orbital transfer vehicle from Spaceflight. It's a company based in Seattle, a broker for small sat launches. And this orbital transfer vehicle, called the Sherpa LTC, will use a bipropellant non-toxic fuel to actually raise its orbit from an initial altitude of less than 200 miles up to more than 600 miles. That's about 300 kilometers to 1,000 kilometers, using a series of engine burns. And once in that 1,000 kilometer or 620 mile orbit, this orbital transfer vehicle will actually host an experiment that is operated and managed by Boeing, and this is a technology demonstration for Boeing's planned constellation of V-band broadband communication satellites, one of multiple companies planning a large constellation of satellites, as we just heard discussing with Dr. Jonathan McDowell earlier in our coverage. We'll also hear periodic call-outs from SpaceX's launch team tonight as we near the T0 time of 10:09 p.m. Eastern Time. Now, 21 minutes or so from liftoff. In the next few moments, we expect to see a large vent of vapor from the strongback. This will mark the end of the fueling of the second stage with the kerosene fuel and the start of chill-down conditioning of the transfer lines leading up the strongback to begin loading liquid oxygen. This is the cryogenic oxidizer that will be loaded into stage 2, beginning in a few minutes.
Stage 2, fuel load is complete.
We just heard the call out from SpaceX Launch Control that the stage 2 fuel load is complete, and we're now seeing that big vent from the strongback that occurs concurrent with the end of loading of fuel into the first stage. This venting comes from the purge and beginning a chill down of the liquid oxygen lines that actually flow the oxidizer into stage 2. This oxidizer will begin loading into stage 2 in about 4 minutes or so. This chart shows the expected trajectory for tonight's mission. The Falcon 9 will follow the track shown here, illustrated by this red line extending northeast from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. We've labeled Space Launch Complex 40, and we've also labeled the approximate location of the drone ship. Just read the instructions, which is on station about 400 miles downrange from the Cape tonight, roughly due east of Charleston, South Carolina, as you can see in this illustration, in this map. So the Falcon 9 will be heading northeast from Cape Canaveral tonight, following a similar familiar trajectory for those of you who have watched Starlink launches in the past on Falcon 9 rockets. The Falcon 9 will be heading downrange northeast, and then once it clears this map, it'll be continuing northeast off the coast of Cape Cod. It'll pass just off the coast of the Canadian Maritime Provinces, and then out over the North Atlantic, and finally over the UK and Europe. Tonight's mission is a bit longer than what we've seen in the past few months for a Starlink launch from Florida. This is a 2-burn profile. 2 burns by the upper stage are needed to reach the proper orbit tonight for deployment of these 51 satellites and the Sherpa LTC Rideshare Payload. The second burn of the upper stage will occur about 45 minutes after launch and is needed to actually circularize the orbit and set up at the proper altitude for separation of this Rideshare Payload. So to accommodate this Rideshare Payload, SpaceX has reduced the number of Starlink satellites from the typical number for these launches of 53 to 54 down to 51, and they've also added this second burn of the upper stage. Now, T-minus 16 minutes and 40 seconds. We're continuing to see the venting out at pad 40. That should end shortly with the start of loading of liquid oxygen into stage 2.
Stage 2 LOX load has started.
And we just heard the call from SpaceX Launch Control that stage 2 LOX load is underway. So liquid oxygen is now flowing into the second stage. This is the 4th and final propellant tank to be loaded this evening at pad 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida. And with the call of loading of LOX, liquid oxygen, into stage 2, we did see the termination of that vent from the strongback. Now inside of 16 minutes until tonight's launch opportunity, the liftoff of this mission, which is Starlink 420, Starlink 4-20, is set for 10:09 p.m. Eastern Time, 2:09 a.m. UTC. Tonight's primary payload for tonight's mission is the next batch of Starlink internet satellites. You can see here a file photo before a previous mission showing what these satellites actually look like in launch configuration. They're buttoned up inside the payload fairing of the Falcon 9 rocket out on pad 40 right now. These satellites are flat packed inside the payload fairing. In this photo, you can see one half of the fairing preparing to encapsulate these Starlink satellites. They're actually held down to the upper stage during launch by 4 metallic retention rods. And once the satellites and the upper stage of the Falcon 9 reach the proper orbit, those retention rods will be jettisoned, released from the rocket. And once those rods are away from the vehicle, it actually allows these 51 Starlink satellites to begin separating from the Falcon 9. They actually separate naturally through differential drag, and then they'll begin activating their deploying their solar panels and activating their propulsion systems to begin climbing to their operational altitude. Here's a bit of a stat sheet on tonight's mission. This mission will be carrying 51 Starlink satellites, as I mentioned. Each of these satellites weighs more than a quarter ton, roughly 250 to 300 kilograms or so. They are solar-powered spacecraft, so they'll be unfurling their solar panels after reaching orbit and deploying off the Falcon 9's upper stage. And then they'll begin using their ion propulsion system, which is fueled by krypton gas, to begin maneuvering to their operational positions in orbit. They're built by SpaceX in Redmond, Washington, near Seattle. And the operational altitude for these satellites, which are actually going into one of 5 different orbital shells, these shells of the Starlink constellation, are at slightly different altitudes, different inclinations, ranging from mid-inclination, like tonight's mission is going to, up to polar orbit. This particular mission is going to shell number 4 at an altitude of 335 miles, or 540 kilometers, at an inclination of 53.2 degrees to the equator. This is what a Starlink user terminal looks like. So you can go to starlink.com if you're interested in signing up for the Starlink broadband service. And you can pay to have this antenna shipped to you. And you'll pay a monthly fee as well for internet service for SpaceX's Starlink internet service. Here's a review of the countdown timeline. We've already passed a few of these milestones at T-minus 35 minutes. Rocket-grade kerosene and liquid oxygen began loading into the first stage of the Falcon 9 rocket. Kerosene was also loaded at that time into stage 2. At T-minus 20 minutes, we heard confirmation that the second stage was loaded, fully loaded with kerosene, and a few minutes later, liquid oxygen loading began on stage 2. Coming up soon, in about 30 seconds, we'll see the beginning of engine chill down. This is the process that thermally conditions the Merlin 1D or M1D engines on the bottom of the first stage for flight. At T-minus 5.5 minutes, the rocket should be fully fueled with kerosene. We should hear a call then that the first stage has been loaded with kerosene fuel. Liquid oxygen loading will continue down to about T-minus 2 minutes. In the final 60 seconds of the countdown, the Falcon 9's onboard computer will begin its final pre-launch checks. The computer will also take command of the countdown. Propellant tanks will be pressurized, and the launch director will give their final go for launch at T-minus 45 seconds. And then at T-minus 3 seconds, the engine controller will give commands to ignite each of those 9 Merlin 1D engines. We just heard confirmation that the engine chill down is now underway, so the M1D engines are now being chilled for ignition.
Stage 1 RP1 load is complete.
Now inside of 5 minutes until liftoff. We showed the map a few minutes ago showing that this rocket will be heading to the northeast after it lifts off from Pad 40 here at Cape Canaveral, Florida. And here's a overview of what to expect after liftoff. The rocket will exceed the speed of sound in about a minute. It'll surpass past the region of maximum aerodynamic pressure at 72 seconds. And the first stage will cut its 9 Merlin engines about 2.5 minutes into the flight. That'll be followed a few seconds later by stage separation. And that first stage will begin its descent back toward the drone ship. Just read the instructions in the Atlantic Ocean. And in parallel with that, at the same time, the upper stage will begin its burn to place these 51 satellites in this spaceflight Sherpa LTC Rideshare Payload into orbit. The first stage will be landing on the drone ship about 8.5 minutes after liftoff. And the second stage will complete its first burn to reach a preliminary transfer orbit around the same time. And the second stage will actually be reigniting its engine 45 minutes and 25 seconds after launch. This is a very quick 2-second burn to kind of circularize the orbit, set up for separation of the Sherpa LTC orbital transfer vehicle. That's the Rideshare Payload tonight at about 49.5 minutes after launch. And then around 23 minutes later, the 51 Starlink satellites will be deployed. We now see the retraction of the strongback from the Falcon 9. It's retracting away to an angle of about 1.5 degrees to the right of the Falcon 9. This sets up for engine start. Now 3 minutes and 20 seconds until liftoff of the Falcon 9. Now, inside 3 minutes to launch. If you're just joining us, I'm Stephen Clark, editor of SpaceflightNow.com. I'm reporting live from the Kennedy Space Center, just a few miles from the Falcon 9's launch pad tonight. If you haven't already, please like our stream here on YouTube. That really helps us gain a bigger following and gain a bigger audience for our coverage here. Also, please consider joining our YouTube channel. We have different membership tiers available to you. And depending on which tier you choose, you can gain access to bonus exclusive video features for members only. And you'll be supporting our coverage, helping us bring you live views like we're bringing you tonight. Now 2 minutes and 20 seconds until launch of the Falcon 9 rocket from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. So we've heard a few milestones in the last couple of minutes. The kerosene tanks on both stages are fully loaded. 46,000 gallons of kerosene have been pumped into the Falcon 9 vehicle over the last 33 minutes or so. Right now, the next thing we should hear is the confirmation that liquid oxygen loading is complete. This is the cryogenic, super cold oxidizer, chilled down, densified several hundred degrees below zero that the Merlin engines also consume on the Falcon 9. We've heard the confirmation that liquid oxygen loading has been completed, now inside of 60 seconds until launch. We've heard confirmation now that the SpaceX launch director has given his final go for launch. 30 seconds. This will be the 40th SpaceX launch of the year. T-minus 15. T-minus 10 seconds. We'll stand by for ignition at T-minus 2 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. There's engine ignition. And liftoff of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket, hauling 51 more Starlink internet satellites to orbit and carrying a rideshare for spaceflight and Boeing. T plus 18 seconds, the Falcon 9 beginning its climb downrange, heading northeast from Cape Canaveral. Gorgeous views of the Falcon 9 heading downrange. We hope you enjoyed some of that ambient noise here in Florida of these 9 Maryland engines doing their job tonight. Falcon 9 heading downrange to the northeast with these 51 Starlink satellites. About 20 seconds remaining until we expect to see the cutoff of stage 1. Main engine cutoff coming up at T plus 2 minutes 29 seconds. That'll be followed by staging and ignition of stage 2. Standing by for MECO. And there's confirmation, visual confirmation of main engine cutoff. We're going to switch to SpaceX's stream, which comes with a few seconds delay, so you may see a little bit of a difference in the clock. There's confirmation of stage separation. And there's ignition of the MVAC engine. That's the Merlin vacuum engine. And that engine nozzle is now glowing red hot. On the left, you see views from stage 1 beginning its maneuvers to head for landing on SpaceX's drone ship. Just read the instructions downrange in the Atlantic. On the right, you're seeing the MVAC Merlin vacuum engine glowing red hot. This is normal for its burn to place these satellites into a preliminary transfer orbit. We've heard now verbal confirmation from SpaceX's launch team that the fairing has separated. That's the nose cone on top of the Falcon 9 vehicle. And we just saw that in this onboard camera view. The second stage will be burning for about 5 more minutes. We're also about 5 minutes from the landing of the first stage on the drone ship. We hope to bring you the coverage of those live as they happen, those events live as they happen. SpaceX says one half of the payload fairing that we just saw jettison is actually flying for the 5th time, and the other half for the 4th time. The booster that we're seeing in action tonight on its 7th flight to space.
Both vehicles continue to follow nominal trajectories.
T plus 5 minutes, 50 seconds. We're continuing to watch live views of the Merlin vacuum engine glowing red hot. Now about 3 minutes left in its burn. We're now showing a map provided by SpaceX showing the locations of these two Falcon 9 stages. Stage 2 accelerating into orbit, heading northeast. Stage 1 in the final couple of minutes of its flight heading toward landing on the drone ship east of Charleston, South Carolina.
Stage 1 entry burn startup.
We've heard confirmation now that the Stage 1 entry burn is underway. This is using 3 of the Merlin engines to begin slowing down for landing. The velocity meter on the lower left, you can see decreasing rapidly as this retro burn continues.
Stage 1 entry burn shut down. Both vehicles continue to follow nominal trajectories.
Now about a minute and a half left remaining until landing of the first stage booster. Again, you're watching live coverage of the Starlink 4-20 mission. Lifted off 7.5 minutes ago from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. We're now nearing the end of the second stage burn and nearing the time of landing of the first stage. We just heard the call that the Stage 1 is now transonic, the booster passing below the speed of sound, final phase of its descent.
Stage 1 landing burn.
Landing burn underway. You're seeing that from an onboard camera on the first stage. The center engine is firing to perform this final retro propulsion burn to slow down for landing.
Deploy.
Landing legs have deployed.
Stage 1 landing confirmed.
And Stage 1 landing has been confirmed. Booster 1052 has arrived on the deck of the drone ship. Just read the instructions. This completes this booster's 7th landing. This booster was first flown back in 2019 as a side booster on 2 Falcon Heavy rockets. It's now been retrofitted, modified rather, for use as a Falcon 9 first stage. And their shutdown of the MVAC engine, the Merlin vacuum engine, has ended the first of its 2 burns required tonight to place these payloads into orbit.
Nominal orbit insertion.
We just heard the call of nominal orbital insertion. This confirms that the Falcon 9 has performed as expected tonight so far, with the second stage in the proper transfer orbit. Another burn coming up at T plus 45 minutes or so. This is an orbit circularization burn to reach the proper altitude for deployment of the 51 Starlink satellites and the Rideshare Payload, which is the orbital transfer vehicle built by Spaceflight. This is the Sherpa LTC orbital transfer vehicle, and it carries a hosted payload for a proposed Boeing broadband constellation. Now, 11.5 minutes since launch, we're going to continue streaming views of this tracking map showing the location of the Falcon 9 upper stage with its 51 Starlink payloads and the Sherpa Rideshare Payload heading toward a second burn of this upper stage engine in about 34 minutes or so. A very quick burn is set for T plus 45 minutes, and that will set up for deployment of the 51 Starlink satellites at T plus 40, or rather the deployment of the Sherpa payload at T plus 49 minutes, and the Starlinks will follow at T plus 72 minutes. Earlier we showed you what the Starlink satellites look like. This is a view of the Rideshare payload tonight. This is the Sherpa LTC orbital transfer vehicle built by Spaceflight. It's a company based in Seattle that provides broker services for small satellite launches, and they've also in recent years been working on these orbital transfer vehicles. This is the Sherpa LTC on board tonight's mission. These orbital transfer vehicles are actually kind of used as kind of like a last mile service for small satellites. So these small satellites that can aggregate onto Rideshare missions such as SpaceX Starlink flights or SpaceX's transporter small sat Rideshare flights, and they can actually use these orbital transfer vehicles to do the final maneuvering to reach the proper altitude and inclination for each payload's mission. So tonight's the payload on the Sherpa LTC flying tonight is the Varuna Technology Demonstration Mission. This is a V-band broadband tech demo for Boeing, which has proposed a satellite of broadband communication satellites, not that different from what SpaceX's Starlink internet constellation does or OneWeb's constellation does, but it's operating in a V-band frequency, which is a different frequency than the Ku-Ka band used by Starlink. And will test out this technology payload's compatibility with systems used by potential customers of the Varuna system. Those include the military, other federal government users, and also potentially commercial customers. Those are the customers that Boeing has in mind while they're working on proposing and developing this broadband constellation of their own. So this Sherpa LTC that you see here will actually be separating from the stack, the payload stack on the Falcon 9 upper stage first, about 49 minutes into the flight, and the orbital transfer vehicle will use a bipropellant propulsion system, thrusters essentially, to maneuver from the drop-off altitude from the Falcon 9, which is about 200 miles or 300 kilometers, and will perform a series of burns to reach an altitude of about 620 miles or 1,000 kilometers. So it'll more than double, almost triple the altitude using the propulsion system on this orbital transfer vehicle. And then once at 1,000 kilometers, the Varuna payload will begin its tech demo mission for a period of up to 2 years, according to regulatory filings with the Federal Communications Commission. As you can see here, the spacecraft has solar panels, so it'll be generating its own electricity during this 2-year tech demo mission. And then at the end of the mission, the Sherpa propulsion system will perform another series of burns to lower its altitude back down to 300 kilometers, and that will allow the spacecraft to naturally decay out of orbit, burn up during reentry during a period of time much shorter than it would be if it remained at 1,000 kilometers due to atmospheric drag. You're now watching a live view from the upper stage of the Falcon 9 looking up, looking forward at the Starlink payload stack. You're now looking at a view of the Merlin vacuum engine nozzle as this coast phase is now about 7 minutes. We're now about 7 minutes into this coast phase, about 30 minutes remaining until the second burn of the second stage engine. The vehicle is now coasting over the North Atlantic Ocean. We'll be continuing to stay live with views as we get them through ground stations from the Falcon 9 upper stage. When we don't have those views, we'll be showing this map showing the location of the vehicle.
Expected loss of signal, Newfoundland. acquisition of signal. Good, Haley. Detected loss of signal, Goonhilly.
We're hearing some occasional callouts from the Launch Control Center of the passage of the Falcon 9 upper stage between ground stations. We heard just then loss of signal from the Goonhilly tracking station in the UK. So it's passed outside of the range of the Goonhilly station. Earlier we heard callouts that it was in range of ground stations in the Newfoundland and on Bermuda. So these are the tracking sites that are receiving telemetry from the Falcon 9 as it flies overhead throughout this mission tonight. 25.5 minutes now since liftoff from Cape Canaveral. 20 minutes to go or so until the restart of stage 2, and that will be followed by the spacecraft deployment sequence. Now T plus 32 minutes, 40 seconds into the flight of Starlink 420. Here are some stats for tonight's flight. This is the 174th launch of a Falcon 9 rocket since the first Falcon 9 demonstration flight took off from Cape Canaveral back on June the 4th of 2010. And it's the 182nd launch of a Falcon rocket overall. This includes Falcon 1s, Falcon 9s, and Falcon Heavies since 2006. It's the 7th flight for this booster, Booster 1052. We saw it land on the drone ship, so it's back on Earth, ready for refurbishment for an 8th flight. This was the 149th Falcon 9 launch from Florida. The rest of the Falcon 9s, 25 Falcon 9s have launched from California. This was the 96th SpaceX launch from Pad 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, and it's the 151st launch overall from Pad 40. This includes Titan rockets. The first Titan rocket launch from Space Launch Complex 40 was back in 1965. The last one was in 2005, and then the launch pad was handed over through a lease from the Air Force to SpaceX in 2007, and SpaceX launched their first mission from Pad 40 in 2010. This was the 116th flight of a reused Falcon 9 booster. This is the 59th flight with a primary payload primarily dedicated to launching Starlink satellites. As we've seen, as I've mentioned, this mission tonight has a Rideshare Payload, this Sherpa LTC orbital transfer vehicle. But the bulk of the payload is comprised with these Starlink satellites. So it's the 59th launch primarily dedicated to deploying Starlink satellites. It's the 40th SpaceX launch of the year, extending that record for most SpaceX missions in a year. And this was the 38th orbital space launch attempt from Cape Canaveral in 2022 rather. And this also extends the record for the most space launches from the Cape in a calendar year. This tally includes SpaceX launches and includes flights by ULA, United Launch Alliance, with their Atlas V rocket, and 2 failed launch attempts by Astra earlier in the year. As you can see in this map, Stage 2 now passing over the Arabian Peninsula. It's just passed over Saudi Arabia, about to head out over the Arabian Gulf and the Indian Ocean. So we're seeing this map now showing stage 2 of the Falcon 9 over the Arabian Gulf, heading southeast, soon to head over the middle of the Indian Ocean. About 8 minutes remaining until the restart of the upper stage engine. This will be a very brief 2-second burn to circularize the orbit. Ground station in the Maldives now tracking Falcon 9. If you haven't had a chance to do so yet, please like our stream. This helps us gain a bigger audience. You can also join our YouTube channel. Our memberships help drive and fund our coverage, help us expand our coverage and bring you content like this tonight, as well as numerous future launches from Cape Canaveral and the Kennedy Space Center. We have several tiers of memberships available for you to choose from. And depending on which level you select, you can gain access to members-only exclusive video features. You can also contribute through the Super Chat function in our chat. We appreciate those of you who have done so tonight. That really helps us bring you this coverage and continue our coverage also on our website, spaceflightnow.com. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel as well to get alerts for when we're going to be going live for our launch coverage in the future. Now, 43.5 minutes or so from launch of the Falcon 9 from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. We just saw a brief view from an onboard camera showing the Merlin vacuum engine beginning what appeared to be its chill down before ignition for this second burn. Here's the engine bell here, now coasting over the Indian Ocean in daylight, orbital daylight. About a minute and a half remaining until ignition of this engine. This burn will last just a couple of seconds. But this engine is powerful, produces more than 200,000 pounds of thrust at full throttle. And with that kind of thrust, you only need a couple of seconds to circularize the orbit. The Falcon 9 is flying at an altitude of 311 kilometers. The target orbit for tonight is near that altitude. Here's the target orbit for tonight after this burn. The Falcon 9 should be flying between 188 and 196 miles, 304 by 316 kilometers, at an inclination of 53.2 degrees. This is the target orbit that this next engine burn seeks to achieve for deployment of the payloads tonight. And there you saw briefly the ignition of the second stage for its second burn. Looked like a good burn of the stage 2 engine there.
Nominal orbit insertion.
And we've heard a call from the launch team of a nominal orbital insertion. So those orbital parameters that I showed you a couple of minutes ago, that is very close to the orbit that was achieved by this burn of the second stage. You can see the Starlink satellites now still attached to the Falcon 9 flying over the Indian Ocean in daylight. About 3 minutes remaining until the deployment of the Sherpa LTC Rideshare Payload. This Sherpa LTC is an orbital transfer vehicle built by Spaceflight. It will be deploying from the Falcon 9, and then will use its own propulsion system to climb from this roughly 300 kilometer altitude up to 1,000 kilometers, about 620 miles for the target altitude for the Sherpa LTC orbital transfer vehicle. And once in that orbit, it will begin a technology demonstration mission for Boeing. This is the Varuna technology demonstration mission to test out the broadband communications technology for Boeing's planned constellation of broadband satellites, internet satellites. They will be testing V-band technology, so that the Varuna system operates in V-band frequencies. This is different than the Ku-band, Ka-band frequencies operated by SpaceX's Starlink network. The payload, the Varuna payload on the Sherpa LTC transfer vehicle was actually built for Boeing by Digital, and the propulsion system on the Sherpa LTC was developed by a company called Benchmark Space Systems. This is a bipropellant system with a fuel and oxidizer, and it's what's known as a green or non-toxic propellant. So it's not a hypergolic propellant, so it doesn't use the toxic hydrazine or nitrogen tetroxide that many spacecraft do. This is a blend of green or non-toxic propellants, liquid propellants. The exact characteristics or nature of the propellants has not been released by Benchmark or Spaceflight, citing proprietary concerns there. now about a minute away from the expected time of deployment of the Rideshare payload tonight. We're about a minute past the expected time that the Sherpa LTC payload was to deploy from the Falcon 9 upper stage. SpaceX says that this deployment is actually occurring without ground station coverage, so the Falcon 9 is flying over a region of the planet where there's no ground station, no tracking station to receive telemetry from the vehicle. So that confirmation will come a little bit later. We'll stand by for that confirmation. This is, again, not an indication of any problem with the mission. Just this is occurring over a part of the planet without any tracking station availability. Once the Sherpa LTC orbital transfer vehicle is free of the Falcon 9 upper stage, the upper stage will actually maneuver to a different attitude. It'll begin actually spinning up to facilitate the release of the 51 Starlink internet satellites. That is expected in about 21 minutes at T+1 hour 12 minutes after launch.
Acquisition of signal, Tasmania.
Sherpa, LTC-2, separation confirmed.
You may have just heard on the launch team audio loop that the team has now confirmed the deployment of the Sherpa LTC Rideshare Payload. This occurred as the Falcon 9 was passing in range of a ground station in Tasmania. This deployment occurred about 10 minutes ago as the Falcon 9 was outside the range of a ground station. The Sherpa LTC is an orbital transfer vehicle built by the company Spaceflight, based in Seattle, and will be climbing into a higher orbit over the coming weeks to begin a tech demo payload for Boeing. So again, the Sherpa LTC Rideshare Payload has indeed deployed from the Falcon 9. That's a confirmation now from SpaceX. This transfer vehicle, the host of the payload on it is the Varuna Technology Demonstration Mission. It will be testing V-band broadband communications technology for a proposed constellation from Boeing to provide internet connectivity to the U.S. government and other customers. Next up will be the deployment of the 51 Starlink satellites. That is now about 12 minutes away. SpaceX says that event will also occur when the Falcon 9 is outside the range of ground stations, so there will be no real-time confirmation of that event either. So no video expected of the deployment of either payload tonight, the Rideshare or the primary Starlink stack. We do anticipate and hope to continue to receive this tracking map from SpaceX, and we hope to also to continue to hear the periodic callouts from the launch team to confirm the deployment of the 51 Starlink satellites once the rocket passes back in range of the ground station. While we wait for the deployment of these 51 Starlink satellites, we'll show you once again. We showed this graphic at the beginning of our broadcast tonight. This is a file photo from a previous Starlink launch showing what these satellites actually look like in launch configuration. They are stacked one on top of the other in a flat-packed type configuration on the payload adapter, which then connects up to the upper stage of the Falcon 9. So this is what these satellites are configured as, what they look like, awaiting deployment from the Falcon 9 tonight. There are 4 retention rods that hold these satellites onto the upper stage during the entire launch sequence and also during pre-launch preparations. And the way they're deployed is actually through the release or jettison of those retention rods. There are 4 of them. They fly free of the Falcon 9, and that allows the Starlink stack to actually naturally separate from the rocket without any use of propulsion or springs to eject the satellites from the launch vehicle, as is often the case with rocket launches and payload deployments on other missions. And the satellites will actually separate from each other using differential drag over the coming hours and days, and then they'll deploy their solar arrays to begin generating electricity, and ultimately they'll use their onboard propulsion to maneuver into their operational altitude. They'll climb from about 300 kilometers, where they're at now, to about 540 kilometers, or 335 miles, to begin commercial internet service. And with these 51 satellites, SpaceX has now launched more than 3,200 Starlink satellites to date on now actually more than 60 missions, 59 dedicated flights for the Starlink network, a couple more rideshare missions where SpaceX launched a few satellites on missions that were primarily geared toward hauling other customer payloads to space.
Expected losses signal, Tasmania.
Now 1 hour, 13 minutes, 35 seconds since SpaceX launched the Starlink 4-20 mission from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida. The 51 Starlink satellites on board this rocket should have deployed from the upper stage about a minute and a half ago. But SpaceX has said this separation event was not going to occur when they had ground station coverage of the rocket, so they would not be receiving any live data from the vehicle during this deployment event. So confirmation of the separation of these 51 Starlink satellites and confirmation of final mission success tonight. We'll have to wait a bit until the rocket is back in range of a ground station. We don't know for sure when that might be, but just based on the trajectory and the orbit of the vehicle, we may have to wait another 20 minutes or so, hopefully not that long, for the rocket to pass back in range of a ground station either in California or Texas. There may be a chance for a ground station in Hawaii to catch a signal from the rocket to confirm this deployment actually happened. But otherwise, the next opportunity will not be for another 15 to 20 minutes as it approaches the west coast of the U.S. and Mexico, where SpaceX has ground stations in California and in South Texas. It's now been an hour and 20 minutes since the liftoff of the Falcon 9 rocket from Cape Canaveral. That occurred at 10:09 p.m. Eastern Time, 2:09 a.m. UTC from Space Launch Complex 40 to begin the Starlink 4-20 mission. We're awaiting confirmation of the deployment of the 51 Starlink satellites. That should have occurred about 8 minutes ago, but that confirmation will not be received by SpaceX Launch Control until the rocket is back within range of a ground station. So we're waiting on that milestone. We expect to and hope to hear that in the next few minutes. While we're waiting for that, we thought we'd go ahead and preview some of the upcoming launches we'll be covering on spaceflightnow.com. The next launch with a confirmed date that we'll be covering is on Tuesday, September the 6th. This is the flight of a European Ariane 5 rocket from French Guiana. The payload is the Eutelsat Connect VHTS, Very High Throughput Satellite. This is a satellite that is designed to support broadband communications. It'll be primarily used to connect to consumers using in-flight Wi-Fi on aircraft. Also some capability for connectivity for ships and mobile users on land. This is a very large satellite. It weighs more than 7 tons, and it is actually flying solo on an Ariane 5 rocket. The Ariane 5 is a heavy lift vehicle. Usually it launches 2 large geostationary communication satellites at a time, but this particular satellite will eat up much of the Ariane 5's lift capability, so it is flying as a solo passenger. Again, the launch is at 5:45 p.m. Eastern Time, 21:45 UTC on Tuesday from French Guiana. This is one of the final 3 Ariane 5 rockets left in the, well, there'll be 3 Ariane 5 missions after this one. This is one of the final 4 Ariane 5s to fly before this mainstay of the global launch industry is retired next year in favor of the next generation Ariane 6 rocket that is under development by the European Space Agency and Arianespace. That will be followed with the next Falcon 9 launch from here in Florida. That is set for next Saturday evening around 7:50 p.m. Eastern Time, 23:50 UTC, September the 10th, next Saturday, with the next batch of Starlink Internet satellites. This mission, like tonight's, will also have a rideshare payload on board. The rideshare for next weekend's launch is called Blue Walker 3. This is the prototype testbed satellite for a planned constellation of broadband satellites being developed by a company called AST Space Mobile. AST Space Mobile is developing a fleet of satellites that is designed to connect directly to cell phone users. So cell phone users, once this constellation is fully up and running, would be able to connect and maintain connectivity with their mobile phones through the AST Space Mobile Blue Walker constellation. This is the first full-size prototype for this constellation, Blue Walker 3. It's about a 1.5-ton satellite hitching a ride on a Falcon 9 rocket with another batch of Starlink satellites on board. That launch is set to go next Saturday from Complex 39A at the Kennedy Space Center. The next day, September the 11th, a week from today, Firefly Aerospace has scheduled their second demonstration flight for the Alpha launch vehicle. This is a small to medium-sized rocket that first launched last September. That launch suffered an engine failure shortly after launch, and the rocket lost control and exploded over Vandenberg Space Force Base. The second launch attempt for the Alpha vehicle is set for September the 11th from Vandenberg. That will be a late afternoon launch, Pacific time in California, and it's launching from Space Launch Complex 2 West, which is the former home of the Delta II rocket out at Vandenberg. The Delta II that dates back to the United Launch Alliance and Boeing, and before that McDonnell Douglas, was a venerable launch vehicle, flew numerous times from Vandenberg, most recently in 2018. That was its last flight. That launch complex has been turned over to Firefly to support their Alpha rocket. And then the next mission launching from Pad 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, which we saw in use tonight, is no earlier than September the 12th. That'll be a Falcon 9 rocket with the Starlink 4-34 mission. This is expected to be a dedicated Starlink flight, as we've seen numerous times this year, with likely 53 or 54 Starlink satellites on that flight. That's next Monday, a week from tomorrow, September the 12th. Amidst all of these launches, SpaceX missions, the Firefly launch coming up, the Ariane 5 launch coming up on Tuesday, we'll be continuing our coverage of the Artemis 1 mission. You're looking live at the Space Launch System on Launch Complex 39B tonight here at NASA's Kennedy Space Center. NASA has attempted 2 times to launch this mission, last Monday and then again yesterday, September the 3rd. Those launch attempts have been cut short by issues initially on Monday with the cooling of one of the engines on the core stage of the Space Launch System, and then yesterday by a hydrogen leak. And NASA is currently assessing their options on repairing that hydrogen leak near the interface between the mobile launch platform and the core stage. And their options range from repairing it inside an environmental enclosure that teams could build at the pad, a temporary enclosure to make that repair at the pad. That would allow the launch team to actually perform a cryogenic test to flow some liquid hydrogen, which is chilled down to more than 400 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, through this area where the leak is, to confirm that they've actually sealed the leak. And that would be give some great data to the team to know that they've addressed the leak, which it's hard to detect a hydrogen leak at ambient temperatures because, again, as I mentioned, the hydrogen is minus 420 Fahrenheit, and when you subject hardware to those cryogenic temperatures, the shape and size changes, so leaks can appear as those components contract. Also, hydrogen is the smallest molecule and can find its way through a leak path where other molecules cannot. So that's one of the options being assessed by NASA this weekend. The other is to actually roll the vehicle back to the vehicle assembly building for that hydrogen leak repair. And complicating matters is a requirement from the Space Force range here at Cape Canaveral to recertify the Space Launch System's flight termination system. This is the destruct mechanism that would be used to destroy the rocket in flight if it veered off course and threatened any populated areas. The certification clock for that flight termination system expires this coming week. So without any relief or waiver from the Space Force and the range safety team, which is responsible for public safety for all launches here in Florida, the Space Launch System will have to be rolled back to the VAB anyway to retest that system, because that destruct system cannot be retested out at the pad. So lots of moving parts and issues being evaluated by the NASA team over the next few days. We expect to hear news from them this week, hopefully, on a path forward, whether the repair will be made to the leak at the pad or inside the vehicle assembly building, and confirmation that, as expected, the vehicle will have to be rolled back to the hangar for retesting of that flight termination system. So a lot of uncertainties on the schedule right now with Artemis 1, when and if it may roll back, and when and if there may be another cryogenic tanking test, and when the next launch attempt will be made. Right now, if the rocket has to roll back to the vehicle assembly building for the leak repair and or the flight termination system retest, that would push the Artemis 1 launch into October, likely to no earlier than October the 17th. But if plans change and the flight termination system retest is not required and the vehicle can stay at the pad, which does not seem likely, but is within the realm of the option space, the trade space being evaluated by NASA, the launch could conceivably happen by the end of September. So we'll await news on that in the coming days. But here's a live view of the Artemis 1 moon rocket out on pad 39B tonight, awaiting its chance to fly the Orion spacecraft on a test flight around the moon. As you can see in this map, 93 minutes since the launch of the Starlink 420 mission, the upper stage is approaching the west coast of Mexico and is likely about to pass in range of a ground station in South Texas. So we may be about to hear confirmation of the successful deployment of the 51 Starlink satellites once that data is received through the SpaceX ground station near Brownsville, Texas, near the Starbase facility on the Gulf of Mexico.
Starlink separation. Acquisition of signal. Keep.
Now 1 hour 36 minutes since the launch of Starlink 4-20 on the Falcon 9 rocket, SpaceX has just confirmed the deployment of the 51 Starlink Internet satellites after the upper stage of the rocket passed back in range of a ground station here at Cape Canaveral, Florida, after completing one orbit of the Earth. The upper stage and the Starlink satellites are now passing over Texas, soon to pass over the Midwest, then out over Canada. But the upper stage is now within communications range of the ground station here in Florida. And through that antenna, SpaceX teams have confirmed that the upper stage has indeed deployed 51 Starlink satellites. This adds 51 more spacecraft to SpaceX's Starlink network. And now to date, SpaceX has launched 3,259 Starlink satellites since the first Starlink test satellites launched back in 2018. A lot of these satellites are no longer in service, no longer in space. There are now roughly 3,000 Starlink satellites in orbit of the 3,259 that have been launched. We had Dr. Jonathan McDowell on our coverage before liftoff. He is the editor of the website planet4589.org, and he maintains on that page a list of Starlink statistics. And his tally now shows 2,990 Starlink satellites in orbit, including these launched tonight. This was the 40th SpaceX launch of the year. The company is now on pace for roughly 60 Falcon 9 missions this year. 40 in the books, 4 months still to go, on pace for around 60 in this calendar year if they maintain this pace. Here's a live view of Space Launch Complex 40, where the Falcon 9 launched at 10:09 p.m. Eastern Time, an hour and 38 minutes ago. You see the strong back here has retracted back to about a 45-degree angle. It moved back to this position at liftoff, and this strong back will be lowered horizontal in the coming days and then return to the hangar at Pad 40, just south of the launch complex itself, where teams will integrate the next Falcon 9 rocket for launch. The next launch from this pad is scheduled in 8 days on no earlier than September the 12th with another batch of Starlink satellites. And of course, we'll be bringing that launch to you live on our YouTube channel. Before we sign off, we'll remind you one more time to please consider becoming a member of our YouTube channel. If you haven't done that, you can choose from several different membership tiers we have available. Depending on which level you select, you can gain access to bonus, members-only video features. Also, please subscribe to our YouTube channel to get alerts when we're going live with broadcasts like tonight for launches and other activity related to the space program here at the Kennedy Space Center and at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. So we're going to sign off now. Thank you for joining us tonight for the launch of the Starlink 4-20 mission. Another successful flight in the books for SpaceX. I'm Stephen Clark, editor of spaceflightnow.com. Thanks for joining us. Have a great rest of your weekend.